I'm Lister Sinclair, and this is Ideas. The 1996 Massey Lectures scheduled for this week will not be heard. In their place, we present a rebroadcast of the 1990 Massey Lectures, entitled Biology as Ideology, The Doctrine of DNA, by Richard C. Lewontin. The Massey Lectures have been an annual event on CBC Radio for the past 29 years. They're commissioned to present CBC listeners with the work of leading figures in the humanities, the arts, politics, and the physical and social sciences. The 1990 Massey Lectures are presented by Richard C. Lewontin, distinguished evolutionary biologist, and Alexander Agassiz, professor of zoology at Harvard University. Professor Lewontin's chief scientific work has been to study the nature of genetic variation in populations, and his experimental and theoretical contributions in this field have brought him many awards and honors. But as well as being a practicing scientist, Professor Lewontin has had a long-standing commitment to social change, and he has succeeded in wedding his two passions throughout his career. In the 1960s, he was one of the few scientists to speak out against the Vietnam War. He was a founding member of Science for the People, an international organization aimed at promoting a science that is answerable to the majority of people rather than being at the service of a few. He created quite an uproar when he resigned from the prestigious National Academy of Sciences over the issue of secret war research, and in protest against the existence of such an elite organization. He's also on the board of directors of the Council on Responsible Genetics, which monitors and critiques the uses to which modern genetic research is put. In addition to numerous scholarly publications, Dr. Lewontin has authored or co-authored a number of popular books on biology, including Human Diversity, a Scientific American publication; Education, IQ, and Class, co-authored with Michelle Schiff; and Not in Our Genes, co-authored with Stephen Rose and Leo Kamin. In his work to demystify science, Professor Lewontin continually exposes the ways in which science interacts with society. In tonight's lecture, he challenges Darwin's adaptionist view of evolution and examines the implications for the environmental movement. And now, Biology as Ideology, Part 5.
In the previous lectures in this series, I've been concerned with a particular ideological bias of modern biology. That bias is that everything that we are, our sickness and health, our poverty and wealth, and the very structure of the society in which we live, is ultimately encoded in our DNA. We are, in the words of Richard Dawkins, the Oxford zoologist, lumbering robots controlled by our DNA, body, and mind. But the view that we're at the mercy of internal forces present within ourselves from birth is part of a deep ideological commitment that goes under the name of reductionism. By reductionism we mean the belief that the world is broken up into tiny bits and pieces, each of which has its own properties, and which combine together to make larger things. The individual makes society, for example, and society is nothing but the manifestation of the properties of individual human beings. Individual internal properties are the causes of things, and the properties of the social whole are the effects of those causes. This individualistic view of the biological world is simply a reflection of the ideologies of the bourgeois revolutions of the 18th century that placed the individual at the center of everything. This view about causes and effects, and autonomy of individual bits and pieces, results not only in a belief that internal forces beyond our control govern what we are as individual people, it also sees an outside world with its own bits and pieces, its own laws, which we as individuals may confront, but we cannot in fact influence. Just as the genes are totally inside of us, so the environment is totally outside of us, and we as actors are at the mercy of both these internal and external worlds. This gives rise to the false dichotomy of nature and nurture. Against those who say that our ability to solve problems, our intelligence, is determined by our genes, there exists a contrary party that says, no, our intelligence is determined by our environment. And so the struggle goes on between those who believe in the primacy of nature and those who believe in the primacy of nurture. The separation between nature and nurture, between the organism and the environment, really goes back to Charles Darwin, who finally brought biology into the modern mechanistic worldview. Before Darwin, it was the view that what was outside and what was inside were part of the same whole system, and one could influence the other. The most famous theory of evolution before Darwin was that of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who believed in the inheritance of acquired characteristics. That is to say, changes occurred in the environment, which in turn caused changes in the body or the behavior of organisms, and these changes, which were induced by the environment, would enter into the hereditary structure of the organisms and would be passed on to the next generation. The story that everyone knows is the giraffe that stretches its neck to eat the leaves on the highest trees. Its offspring then have slightly longer necks. These are then passed on to the next generation, which again stretch their necks until finally we have giraffes of great long necks. In this view, there's nothing that really separated what was outside from what was inside, because external alterations, the stretching of the neck, would enter into the organism and be perpetuated into future generations. Darwin completely rejected this worldview and replaced it by one in which organisms and environment were totally separated. The external world had its own laws, its own methods of operation, and organisms confronted these and experienced them and either successfully adapted to them or failed. It's the notion that you can't fight City Hall. Adapt or die. Those organisms whose properties enabled them to cope with the problems set by the external world would survive and leave offspring, and the others would fail to do so and leave no trace. So the species would change, not because the environment directly caused physical changes in the organism, but because those organisms smart enough or better built enough to be able to handle the problems thrown at them by nature would leave more offspring who would resemble them. The deep point of Darwinism was the separation between the forces of the environment that created the problems and the internal forces of the organisms that threw up the solutions to the problems more or less at random. The correct solutions were the ones that were preserved. The external and internal forces of the world were behaving in their own independent ways. The only connection between them was a passive one. The organisms who happened to be lucky enough to find a match between what was going on inside of themselves and what was going on outside of themselves survived. Darwin's view was really essential to our successful unraveling of evolution, because Lamarck was simply wrong about the way in which the environment influences heredity. And Darwin's alienation of the organism from the environment was an essential first step in a correct description of the way in which the forces of nature act on each other. The problem is that it was only a first step, and we have become frozen there. Modern biology has become completely committed to the view that organisms are nothing but the battlegrounds between the outside forces and the inside forces. Organisms are the passive consequences of external and internal activities outside their control. As I've said, this view has important political reverberations. It says that the world is really outside our control, that we must take it as we find it and do the best we can to make our way through the minefield of life using whatever equipment our genes have provided to us to get to the other side in one piece. What is so extraordinary about the view of an external environment set for us by nature and essentially unchangeable, except in the sense that we might ruin it and destroy the delicate balance that nature has created in our absence, is that it's completely in contradiction to what we actually know about organisms and environment. When we free ourselves of the ideological bias of atomism and reductionism and look squarely at the actual relations between organisms and the world around them, we find a much richer set of relations, and one that has very different consequences for social and political action than are usually supposed. What is the actual relationship between organisms and the environment? First, there is no environment in some independent and abstract sense. Just as there is no organism without an environment, there is no environment without an organism. Organisms do not experience environments, they create them. They construct their own environments out of the bits and pieces of the physical and biological world, and they do so by their own life activities. Are the stones and the grass in my garden part of the environment of a bird? The grass is certainly part of the environment of a phoebe who gathers dry grass to make a nest. But the stone around which the grass is growing means nothing to that phoebe. On the other hand, the stone is part of the environment of a thrush, who may come along with a garden snail and break the shell of the snail against the stone. Neither the grass nor the stone are part of the environment of a woodpecker, who's living in a hole in a tree at the base of the garden. That is, bits and pieces of the world outside of these organisms are made relevant to them by their own life activities. If you use grass to make a nest, then the grass is part of your environment. If you use stones to break snails on, then stones are a part of your environment. There's an infinity of ways in which parts of the world can be assembled to make an environment. So how do we know what the environment of an organism is? In fact, we consult the organism. Not only do we consult the organism, but when we describe the environment, we describe it in terms of the organism's actual behavior and life activities. If you're in any doubt of this, you might try asking a professional ecologist to describe the environment of some bird. She or he will say something like the following. Well, the bird builds its nest 3 feet off the ground in hardwoods. It eats insects part of the year, but then may switch to seeds and nuts when insects are no longer available. It flies south in the winter and comes back north in the summer. And when it's foraging for its food, it tends to stay in the higher branches and at their outer tips, and so on, and so on. Notice that every word uttered by my ecologist in describing the environment of the bird will be a description of the actual life activities of the bird. That process of description reflects the fact that the ecologist has learned what the environment of the bird is by watching birds. A practical demonstration of the difficulty of describing an environment without having seen the organism that created it is the case of the Mars lander. When the United States decided to send a landing module to Mars, biologists wanted to know if there was any life there. So the problem was, how do you design a machine to detect life on Mars? There are several interesting suggestions. One is to send a kind of microscope with a long, sticky tongue that would unroll on the surface of Mars and then roll back up again, and put whatever dust it found there under a microscope. If there was anything that looked like a living organism, one could see it in the images sent back to Earth. One might call this the morphological definition of life. If it looks right and it wiggles, then it's alive. What appears to be a more sophisticated approach was actually taken. Instead of asking whether things look alive, it was decided to ask whether they do what living things do. So the Mars lander contained a variant of what was called the wolf trap, after one of its inventors, Wolf Vishniac. The wolf trap was essentially a long hose attached to a vacuum cleaner, inside of which was a container of radioactive chicken soup. When the lander got to Mars, it would suck up some dust into the chicken soup, and if there was any living organism in the dust, those organisms would break down the chicken soup as bacteria do on Earth. Then radioactive carbon dioxide would be produced, and a detector in the machine would signal the presence of this radioactive carbon dioxide. In fact, that's exactly what happened. When the Mars lander sucked up the dust, radioactive carbon dioxide was produced in a pattern that had everybody convinced that there was life on Mars fermenting the chicken soup. But then suddenly, the process stopped and there wasn't any further fermentation. It just shut down suddenly. This wasn't what living organisms were supposed to do, and the consequence was that people were confused. A conference was held at MIT to debate the issue and decide whether or not there was life on Mars. The decision was that there wasn't any, and what was really going on was a kind of chemical reaction on finely divided clay particles that one doesn't ordinarily see on Earth. Later on, this reaction was actually mimicked in the laboratory, so everybody has now agreed that they voted correctly and that there's no life on Mars. The problem with this experiment is precisely the one about organisms defining their own environments. How do you know whether there's life on Mars? What you do is you present Martian life with an environment and you see whether they live in it. But how can we know what the environment of Martian life is unless we've seen Martian organisms? All the experiment showed was that there's no Earth-like life on Mars. We may know the temperature, the gas content of the atmosphere, and the humidity, and something about the soil on Mars, but we don't know what a Martian environment is like because the environment doesn't consist of temperature, gas, moisture, and soil. It consists of an organized set of relationships among bits and pieces of the world, an organization that has been created by living Martian organisms themselves, if they exist. We must replace Darwin's adaptationist view of life with a constructionist one. It's not that organisms find environments and either adapt themselves to them or die. They actually construct their environments out of bits and pieces. In this sense, the environment of organisms is coded in their DNA, and we find ourselves in a kind of reverse Lamarckian position. Whereas Lamarck supposed that changes in the external world would cause changes in the internal structures, we see that the reverse is true. An organism's genes, to the extent that they influence what the organism does in its behavior, physiology, and morphology, are at the same time helping to construct an environment. So, if genes change in evolution, the environment of the organism will change too. Consider the immediate environment of a human being. If one takes motion pictures of a person with the right sort of optics, called Schlieren optics, one can actually see that there's a layer of warm, moist air that completely surrounds each one of us, and that is slowly rising from our legs and bodies and going off the top of our heads. Every living organism, including trees, has this boundary layer of warm air that's created by the metabolism of the organism itself. The consequence is that we are encapsulated in a little atmosphere created by our own metabolic activities. That, in fact, is the source of the so-called wind chill factor. The reason it gets much colder when the wind blows across us is because the wind is blowing away that boundary layer, and our skins are then exposed to the outer stratosphere, and we experience a very different set of temperatures and humidities. Now let's think about a mosquito feeding on the surface of a human body. That mosquito is completely immersed in the boundary layer that we've constructed. It's living in a warm, moist world. But one of the most common evolutionary changes for all kinds of organisms is a change in size. And over again, organisms have evolved to be larger. If the mosquito species begins to evolve to a larger size, it may in fact find itself with its back in the stratosphere and only up to its knees in the warm, moist boundary layer while it's feeding. The consequence will be that the mosquito's evolution has put it into an entirely different world. Moreover, as human beings early in their evolution lost hair and changed the distribution of sweat glands over their bodies, the thickness of that boundary layer changed. So the evolutionary changes in the genes of human beings changed the world in which they lived, making it rather less hospitable for fleas, mosquitoes, and other parasites that live on hairy animals. The first rule of the real relationship between organisms and environment is that environments do not exist in the absence of organisms, but are constructed by them out of bits and pieces of the external world. The second rule is that the environment of organisms is constantly being remade during the life of those living beings. When plants send down roots, they change the physical nature of the soil in which they are living, breaking it up and aerating it, and they exude chemicals that change the soil's chemical nature as well. They make it possible for various beneficial fungi to live together with and to penetrate their root systems. They change the height of the water table by pulling up water. They alter the humidity in their immediate neighborhood, and the upper leaves of plants change the amount of light that's available to the lower leaves. When the Canada Department of Agriculture takes weather records for agricultural purposes, they don't set up a weather station in an open field or on the roof of a building. They take measurements of temperature and humidity at various levels above the ground in a field of growing plants, because the plants are constantly changing the actual physical conditions that are relevant to agriculture. Moles burrow in the soil. Earthworms, through their castings, completely change the local topology. Beavers have had at least as an important effect on the landscape in North America as humans did until the beginning of the last century. Every breath you take removes oxygen and adds carbon dioxide to the world. Mort Saul once said, "Remember, no matter how cruel and nasty and evil you may be, every time you take a breath you make a flower happy." Every single living creature is in a constant process of changing the world in which it lives by taking up materials and putting out others. Every act of consumption is an act of production. and every act of production is an act of consumption. When we consume food, we produce not only gases, but solid waste products that are in turn the materials for the consumption of some other organism. A consequence of the universality of environmental change induced by the life activity of organisms is that every organism is both producing and destroying the conditions of its own existence. There's a lot of talk about how we as human beings are destroying the environment. But we're not unique in the fact that our life processes are recreating the world in a way that is in part hostile to the continuation of our lives. Every bacterium uses up food material and excretes waste products that are toxic to it. Organisms not only ruin the world for their own lives, but for their children as well. The entire vegetational landscape in New England, where I live, is a consequence of that process. The forest primeval in New England consisted of a mixture of whispering pines and hemlocks and hardwoods. As agriculture spread at the end of the 18th and through the 19th century, all of those forests were cut down and replaced by farms. Then, just before and after the Civil War, there were wholesale migrations out of the rocky soils of New England, where you could hardly plant a crop, to the deep and productive and hospitable soils of the Middle West. As a result, farms were abandoned and plants started to infiltrate into these old fields. The first thing that came in was a variety of weeds and herbs, and these were replaced later by white pines. White pines can form an almost pure stand in an old field, and many such pure white pine stands could be seen in New England earlier in this century. Unfortunately, they don't last. The pines make a dense shade which is inhospitable to the growth of their own seedlings, and because of this shade intolerance, the pines can't replace each other. As the pines die, or if, as in New England, they were cut wholesale, what comes in are hardwoods, whose seedlings have been waiting around for just a little opening. The white pines disappear forever, with the exception of an occasional old tree, and a composition similar to the prehistoric virgin forest appears. This old field white pine hardwood succession, as it's called, is a consequence of the fact that the conditions of light and soil are changed by the pine trees in such a way that their own offspring can't succeed them in the same place. The generation gap, you see, is not simply a human phenomenon. So we must put away the notion that out there is a constant and fixed world that we're uniquely disturbing and destroying. We're certainly changing it, as all organisms do. And we certainly have a power that other organisms do not have, both to change the world extremely rapidly and by willful activity to change the world in various ways that we may think beneficial. Nevertheless, we cannot live without changing the environment. That is the second law of the relationship between organism and environment. Third, organisms actually determine how the fluctuations of nature may have an impact on themselves. Organisms are capable of averaging over time and buffering out the fluctuations in physical factors. An important example is the way in which animals and plants store sunlight. Even though the conditions for growth and good nutrition do not exist all year round in a temperate zone, it's not only farmers who make hay while the sun shines. Potatoes are the storage organs of potato plants, and acorns form the storage for oak trees, or at least for their offspring. Other organisms, in turn, use these storage devices for their own storage. So, squirrels store away acorns for use in the winter, and human beings store away potatoes. As human beings, we have even a further level of averaging, which is called money. Money is the way in which, through futures contracts, for example, fluctuations in the availability of natural products are ironed out for the market. And savings banks are where we put money away for a rainy day. So organisms do not, in fact, perceive, at a physiological level, much of the fluctuation that goes on in external nature. Conversely, organisms have techniques of reacting to the rates of change of the external world rather than just the actual levels of the resources. Water fleas are sometimes sexual and sometimes asexual in their reproduction. They change from non-sexual reproduction to sexual reproduction when a drastic change occurs in the environment, and they produce males rather than the females that were the exclusive makeup of the species before. That drastic change may be in the amount of oxygen in the water, or the change in its temperature, or a change in food availability. They don't alter from non-sexual to sexual when the temperature is high or when it's low, but when it changes rapidly in either direction. They are detectors of change, pure and simple. Our visual system is also a very sensitive detector of change. Our central nervous system, by a complex processing of images, enables us to see differences in intensity of light across edges in a way that's far superior to what any physical and electronic device can do. We accomplish this by magnifying differences across small distances. Thus, we have greater visual acuity than any optical scanning machinery. The third rule, then, of organism and environment is that fluctuations in the world only matter as organisms perceive and transform them. Finally, organisms actually change the basic physical nature of signals that come to them from the external world. As the temperature in this studio rises, partly because of the activity in which I'm now engaged, my liver detects that temperature change, but not as a rise in temperature. It detects it as a change in the concentration of sugar in my blood and the concentration of certain hormones. So it begins outside as a change in the rate of vibration of air molecules, a change in temperature, is converted inside my body into a change in the concentration of certain chemical substances. And this has all occurred because of the nature of my genes, which have a strong influence on the anatomy and physiology responsible for that change in physical signal. When I'm out in the desert doing my field work and I hear and see a rattlesnake, those rarefactions of the air that impinge on my eardrums and those photons of light that come into my eye are changed by my central nervous system into a chemical signal, and suddenly my adrenaline starts to flow. But those vibrations and photons would be changed to a very different chemical signal in the body of another snake that's receiving exactly the same sights and sounds. That's especially true if it were a snake of the opposite sex, and a very different hormone would be induced. But this difference in transformation of one signal into another is coded in my genes and in the genes of the snake. So the last rule of the relationship between organism and environment is that the very physical nature of the environment, as it is relevant to the organism, is determined by the organism itself. Now, it might be objected that this interactive picture of organism and environment is all very well, but it ignores some obvious aspects of the external world over which we have no control. A human being may have discovered the law of gravitation, but he certainly didn't pass it. You can't fight gravity. But that, in fact, is not true. A bacterium living in liquid does not feel gravity because it's so small and its buoyant properties free it from what's essentially a very weak force. But the size of a bacterium is a consequence of its genes. And so it's the genetic difference between us and bacteria that determines whether or not the force of gravitation is or is not relevant to us. On the other hand, bacteria feel a universal physical force that we don't, and that's the force of what's called Brownian motion, the constant bombardment of all the air molecules that are moving around and striking us. Precisely because bacteria are so small, they're battered from one side to the other by the motion of these molecules. We, fortunately, are not constantly reeling from one side of the room to the other because we're so large. All the forces of nature depend for their influence on size, distance, and time duration. But how large an organism is, how rapidly it alters its state and position, how far it is from other organisms of different sizes and kinds, are all deeply influenced by those organisms' genes. And so, in a very important sense, the physical forces of the world, insofar as they are relevant to living beings, are encoded in those beings' genes. We cannot talk about living organisms as just products of their genes, but we must recognize that the genes interact with the environment in producing the organism in its development and activity. But reciprocally, we can't make the mistake of saying that organisms confront an autonomous external world. The environment influences organisms only through interaction with their genes. The internal and the external are inextricably bound up. These facts of the relationship between organism and environment have very important consequences for current political and social movements. There is a widespread perception that in many ways the world is becoming a rather less pleasant and more threatening place to live in. And there's a good possibility that it may grow catastrophically unpleasant in the not-too-distant future. It may get a lot warmer. A good deal more ultraviolet light may strike us than now does. The world doesn't smell very good. There are all sorts of noxious substances that are the agents of illness and even death. And we recognize all these changes as the consequence of human activity. So it's right that human beings should want to make a world in which they can live happy, healthful, and reasonably long lives. But we can't do that under the banner of save the environment, because that slogan assumes that there is an environment which has been created by nature and which we in our foolishness are destroying. It assumes, too, that there's such a thing as the balance of nature, that everything is in balance and harmony, and that harmony is only being destroyed by the foolishness and greed of human beings. There's nothing in our knowledge of the world that suggests that there's any particular balance or harmony in it. The physical and biological worlds have been in constant change since the beginning of the earth. They have been in a state of flux, much of which has been far more drastic than anyone can conceive of at the present time. Indeed, much of what we conceive of as the environment has been creation of living organisms. Our atmosphere is about 18% oxygen and a fraction of a percent carbon dioxide. That is, the atmosphere which we all breathe and which we hope we can continue to breathe. But that atmosphere was not on Earth before living organisms. On the contrary, most of the oxygen was bound up in chemicals, and there was a very large amount of carbon dioxide, because oxygen is a very unstable compound and simply doesn't exist in a free form if you simply leave it alone. The carbon dioxide was removed from the original atmosphere and deposited in limestone and in chalk by the action of algae and bacteria during the early history of the Earth. The oxygen, which was not present at all, was put into the atmosphere by the activity of the early plants. Present-day animals and plants have evolved in a world made for them by the earlier organisms. Only 60,000 years ago, Canada was completely under the ice, as was the middle of the United States. The environment has never existed, and there has never been balance or harmony. 99.999% of all species that ever existed are already extinct, and in the end, all will become extinct. Indeed, life is about half over. Our estimates are that the very first living organisms appeared on Earth on the order of 3 or 4 billion years ago. And we know from stellar evolution that our sun is going to expand and burn up the Earth in another 3 or 4 billion years, putting an end to everything. So, any rational environmental movement has got to abandon the romantic and totally unfounded ideological commitment to a harmonious and balanced world in which the environment is preserved. Instead, it's got to turn its attention to the real question, which is, how do people want to live, and how are they to arrange that they live that way? For example, the demand for biodegradable materials has to be understood as a demand for the use of things that people want to preserve. For example, if we get rid of plastics and replace them by paper or wood, we have to cut down more forests. But if we cut down more forests, we will have a greater greenhouse effect because the forests will not be fixing the carbon dioxide. The important point is not that we should go on with our industrial enterprises as we are doing now, but that every demand for a change in the direction of development be analyzed not as a demand for the cessation of change, but as a demand for the reorientation of the direction of change. Everything changes. Nothing remains the same. In the words of Herbert Spencer, change is a beneficent necessity. So, human beings are not unique in the way in which they make a radical change in the world. But they do have a unique property not shared by other organisms. It's not the destructive property, a property which is shared by all organisms, but the property that they can plan the changes that will occur in the world. They can't stop the world from changing, but they may be able, with appropriate social organization, to divert those changes in a more beneficial direction, and so perhaps even postpone their extinction for a few 100,000 years. Is it within the biological capability of human beings to reorganize their futures? This question brings us back again to the issue of human nature and its biological determination. If sociobiologists are right, then human beings have limitations coded in their genes, which make them individually entrepreneurial, selfish, aggressive, xenophobic, family-oriented, driven towards dominance, self-interested in a way that precludes any real possibility for a radical reorganization of society. You can't fight human nature. On the other hand, if Prince Kropotkin were right, that biologically human beings were impelled toward cooperation and have been artificially held away from it historically, then such a reorganization might be possible. So it would seem that indeed we do need to know the truth about individual human biological limitations. After all, how can we transcend the limitations that are part of our biological nature? In his book on sociobiology, Professor Wilson says, if the decision is taken to mold cultures to fit the requirements of the ecological steady state, some behaviors can be altered experientially without emotional damage or loss in creativity, but others cannot. We do not know how many of the most valued qualities are linked genetically to the more obsolete destructive ones. Cooperativeness towards group mates might be coupled with aggressivity towards strangers, creativeness with a desire to own and dominate. If the planned society, the creation of which seems inevitable in the coming century, were deliberately to steer its members past those stresses and conflicts that once gave the destructive phenotypes their Darwinian edge, the other phenotypes might dwindle with them. In this, the ultimate genetic sense, social control would rob man of his humanity. It appears, then, that we need to know what the genetic linkages are between the various aspects of an individual's behavior. Because if we don't, we may, in our blundering attempts to create a better world, ruin it altogether. Perhaps we really had better sequence the entire human genome, as so many molecular biologists want to do, because that's a first step, although an insufficient one, to understanding what human limitations might be. This demand for biological information implies that society needs to be guided in the end by a technocratic elite who understands genetics. What's even worse is that it totally confounds the properties and limitations of individuals with the properties and limitations of the social institutions that they create. It is the ultimate political manifestation of the belief that individual autonomous units determine the properties of the collectivities in which they assemble. But when we actually look around at society, we see that the opposite's true. If we have to characterize social organization and its consequences, it is that social organization does not reflect the limitations of individual biological beings, but it negates those limitations. No individual human being can fly by flapping his or her arms and legs. That's indeed a biological limitation, having to do with our size and the size of our appendages. Nor could human beings fly if a very large number of them all got together in one room and all flapped their arms and legs together. Yet I did fly to Toronto to record these lectures. I flew as a consequence of social action. Airplanes and airports are products of educational institutions, of scientific discoveries, of the organization of money, of the production of petroleum and its refining, metallurgy, the training of pilots, the actions of government in creating air traffic control systems, all of which are social products. Those social products have come together to make it possible for me as an individual to fly. It's important to note that although they're social products, it's not society that flies. Society can't fly. Individuals fly, but they fly as a consequence of social organization. Sherlock Holmes once explained to Dr. Watson that he didn't know whether the sun went around the earth or the earth went around the sun, because it didn't make any difference whatsoever to his affairs. He analogized his mind to a kind of attic in which you could put just a certain amount of lumber, and every new fact added had to displace an old one. And he was absolutely right. There's indeed a limit to what any human being can remember. If by remember you mean the number of things that one can pull out of one's head. No historian of health and disease can remember all the bills of mortality, all the demographic statistics since the 19th century. Yet historians do remember those facts because they can look them up in books. And books are a social product, as are the libraries that hold them. So social activity makes it possible for us to remember what no human being could remember as an isolated entity. Individual biological limitations, understood from viewing individuals as isolated entities in a vacuum, are not individual limitations for individuals embedded in society. It's not that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. It's that the properties of the parts cannot be understood except in their context in the whole. Parts do not have individual properties in some isolated sense. They only have properties in the context in which they are found. But the biological theory of human nature misses the point, because it searches for that nature in the products of genes in individuals, and the limitations of individuals caused by those genes, or it searches for them in the properties of an external world which are fixed, and which cannot be altered, except in a destructive way. It is indeed the case that human social and political organization is a reflection of our biological being. For after all, we are material biological objects developing under the influence of the interaction of our genes with the external world. It's certainly not the case that our biology is irrelevant to social organization. The question is, what part of our biology is relevant? If one were to choose a simple biological property of human beings that was of supreme importance, it would be our size. The fact that we are somewhere between 5 and 6 feet tall has made all of human life possible as we know it. Gulliver's Lilliputians, who were said to be 6 inches tall, could not in fact have had the civilization that he ascribed to them, because 6-inch tall human beings, no matter how they were shaped and how they were formed, could not have created the rudiments of a technological civilization. For example, they couldn't have smelted iron. They couldn't have mined minerals because a 6-inch tall being couldn't get sufficient kinetic energy from swinging a tiny pickaxe to break rocks. That's why when babies fall, they don't hurt themselves. It's not that they're so relaxed. It's because they aren't very big. Nor could the Lilliputians have controlled fire, because the tiny twigs that they could bring to a fire would burn up instantly. Nor could they have even thought about mining, or have been able to speak, because their brains would have been physically too small. It takes a central nervous system of a certain size to have enough connections and enough complexity for speech. Ants may be terribly strong and terribly clever for their size, but their size alone guarantees that they'll never write books about people. The most important fact about human genes is that they help to make us as big as we are and to have a central nervous system with as many connections as it has. But there are not enough genes to determine the shape and structure of that nervous system, nor of the consciousness, which is an aspect of that structure. Yet it is that consciousness that creates the environment in which we live, its history, and the direction of its future. This then provides us with a correct understanding of the relation between genes and the shape of our lives. Our DNA is a powerful influence on our anatomies and physiologies. In particular, it makes possible the complex brain that characterizes human beings. But having made that brain possible, the genes have made possible human nature, a social nature whose limitations and possible shapes we do not know, except insofar as we know what human consciousness has already made possible. In Simone de Beauvoir's clever but deep apothegm, a human being is l'être dont l'être est de n'être pas, the being whose essence is not having an essence. History far transcends any narrow limitations that are claimed for either the power of genes or the power of the environment to circumscribe us. Like the House of Lords, that destroyed its own power to limit the political development of Britain by the successive reform acts to which it assented, so the genes, in making possible the development of human consciousness, have surrendered their power both to determine the individual and its environment. They have been replaced by an entirely new level of causation, that of social interaction, with its own laws and its own nature, that can only be understood and explored through that uniquely human form of experience, social action.
This has been the concluding segment of the 1990 Massey Lectures, presented by Richard C. Lewontin.